Here is the understanding. The Lord is saying, in this season, as we enter the new decade, it's a season to cross. Now, the Jordan, I'm reading out of Joshua 1, 10, and 11, specifically verse 11. Yeah, I'm not going to try to explain the river Jordan at this time, but let's say it's the threshold that separates the desert from the promised land. The desert meaning the 40 years behind us, as amazing as our salvation out of Egypt was, as amazing as the presence of God was in the desert with all that manna and the water out of the rock, and the non-feeble in our tribes, and all the victories against our enemies, all that was amazing, but it's a desert. But now we're at the Jordan and we're called to cross over. And what is beyond the Jordan is the promised land, but we need to possess it. We need to conquer it. And we need to understand why in Joshua chapter 2 in verse 1, when Joshua sent 2 men to spy the land, he did not say just view the land. He also said especially Jericho. Now, here is the part which I hope I'll be able to say with a few words. 40 years before, God sent them out of Egypt and said, look, this ahead of you is the land that I'm giving you as an inheritance, is the promised land. Now go in and possess it because I have given it to you. And then they sent 12 spies. They came back, the 10 of them, with a bad report. Then the people decided we cannot do what God said that we are supposed to do. Why? Because the inhabitants of the land, they're like giants. We're like locusts in front of them. We cannot fight against them. We cannot prevail. They are too strong for us. And God was angry with that generation. And he said, well, if that's what you choose, you shall all die in the desert. Now, 40 years later, it's not just the land. Now there is an addition. 40 years before, it was the land. After 40 years, it's the land and Jericho. And what does Jericho look like? It looks like a fortress that cannot be defeated. The walls of Jericho were big. The history tells us that the city of Jericho had never been overtaken by an enemy. The siege of the city could not produce any result because the walls were too strong and they were too powerful. Nobody could take that city. Just the size of those amazing walls produced unbelief. I'm not going to explain unbelief in this message, but we are not talking about a simple state of unbelief where I do not believe in something. We're talking about an atmosphere of unbelief, which causes me, I'll say differently, which incapacitates me from believing. It enforces upon me both unbelief and a conviction that it is impossible to do what God said that he will do. So what happened in those 40 years? Before, there was no specific stronghold. It was just the people of the land. Now it's the people of the land and a stronghold. I'm not saying that those walls were built in those 40 years. I don't really know the history behind it, but it's irrelevant. What is relevant is this. Look, Joshua could have crossed over in another part of Jordan. Joshua could have gone into the promised land without attacking Jericho. But as we read on in Joshua 6, in verse 2, the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. Here is the message. The Jericho stronghold is because it's the manifestation of the unbelief that was built 40 years before. The unbelief that overtook the people of God because they did not take to heart the word of God and they did not act on it has now become a fortress that seems like nobody can defeat it. Why is it there? Because we need to defeat the stronghold of unbelief that was built in the previous generation that went before us. Now, please understand this is prophetic. It may not necessarily apply to every Christian everywhere. It definitely applies to my nation, Hellas. I'll say this again. In our generation, more specifically in this time, in this new decade, we are called to address the stronghold of unbelief, which was put there in front of us to block the way into the promised land because of the unbelief of the previous generation who failed to do what God told them to do. So now it's no longer just the land and the inhabitants. Now it's the land and the inhabitants and Jericho. But when we undo what the previous generation did, that means when we demolish the stronghold of unbelief that the previous generation raised up by not believing in God's promises,